I came home late one night when I was about 17 years old. The rest of my family was already fast asleep in bed. I headed over to my room and did the typical stuff I would just before I went to sleep. I worked on my homework a bit, talked to my friends on the phone, and listened to a bunch of my personal music. Finally, I went to bed a couple of hours later and started to nod off. I was very suddenly awoken though by some rustling coming from underneath my bed. At first, I assumed it was just my cat. I rolled over to go back to sleep. A short while later though, I was woken up once again. I laid there perfectly still and quiet and listened to the noises a bit closer. This was when I realized the noise coming from underneath my bed was coming from an animal much larger than any damn cat could ever be. Since I lived nearby the woods, my imagination was starting to run wild. Was it a rabid raccoon? A sinister skunk? A crazed coyote? It took me about 5 minutes to work up the courage to peek underneath my bed and try to figure out just what I was dealing with. I carefully rolled over and glanced down through the small gap between my mattress and my bed frame, only to see the scariest thing I'd ever seen. All I could see was the hair-covered arm of a man. My heart started racing, and I felt like either vomiting or shitting myself. I knew I needed to run in that moment, but all I could think of was that this diabolical murderer was going to reach out and slash my Achilles tendon as soon as I stood up to run, and my ankles were within his hairy arm's reach. Finally though, after some time, I gathered up the courage to leap from my bed and make a mad dash toward the door. This is when I realized it's actually possible to be so terrified that no noise comes out when you scream. I made it out the door and was running for the stairs up to my parents' room when I was grabbed from behind. A hand was clasped tight over my mouth. Long story short, once the guy started whispering for me to be quiet, I realized I knew who this person was. It was a guy I'd been on a few dates with previously. He whispered into my ear, apologizing for scaring me, and said he hadn't meant to. He just wanted to see what I was like when I was alone and asleep. Well, of course, I hysterically started crying and telling him to get the fuck out of my house. He even had the damn nerve to ask me to give him a ride home after. How about no? I learned a couple lessons in that moment. My parents sleep like the dead and don't even wake up when their child is near murder just outside their room. 2, sneaking into a girl's house and hiding underneath her bed to watch her sleep is not really an acceptable way to learn more about her. And 3, I also may possibly be too nice and understanding. In hindsight, I should have called the cops on this guy right away, but instead I just told him to leave me alone from then on and not talk to me ever again. My parents kinda gaslighted me by telling me that he seemed like a nice boy who just made a bad judgment call. This incident still haunts me years later though, and it was absolutely terrifying in the moment. I love to ride my bike along the country roads of a tiny town called 3 Oaks in Michigan. On a recent Saturday, my wife was working, and I had nothing to do that day. I strapped my bike to my car and drove the hour to 3 Oaks. I parked in the scenic downtown area, then rode out of the town and into the surrounding countryside. As I wound my way deeper into the remote areas of that countryside, houses, businesses, and even cars in general grew increasingly scarce. Eventually, there was only an occasional house every half mile or mile. Flanking the dirt and gravel roads that I pedaled down, between these occasional houses, there were vast fields of corn and small thickets of trees. It's on one of these back roads that a minivan drove past me. Within moments of it passing by, it turned around and pulled up alongside me. I looked over. The passenger, a woman in her mid to late 20s, was looking at me with her window down. The driver, a man of seemingly the same age, leaned over the passenger and said to me in a slight southern drawl with a big smile on his face, "Hey, do you know David Christ?" I thought for a brief second, but I didn't know anyone by that name, so I told him no. "Oh, so you don't know of him at all?" I said that I did not and apologized. I continued to pedal on. The van sat for a moment, then pulled a U-turn and drove off in the direction they were originally heading. I didn't really think much of the encounter. Maybe the driver was a friend of this David Christ, and he thought we had met through David or something. I don't know. At the time, I didn't really think I had any reason to worry. I continued on my ride instead, turning down this road and heading north, then turning down that road and heading east. I didn't really have an agenda for my ride that day. I was just out to enjoy the warm summer and meander through the relaxing countryside. Maybe 10 minutes later, though, I was now on a completely different road and heading in an all-new direction when I passed by the van once again. This time, we were heading toward each other. I gave a smile and a nod as I passed them by. I remember, though, thinking it was an odd coincidence that I should come across this van again. He had a big smile on his face as he drove past. At this point, I began wondering what these people were doing. Perhaps they might be lost, looking for this David Christ guy, or maybe they were just enjoying a scenic drive. Perhaps they thought I looked like a friend of a friend or something. I didn't know, but at this point I was starting to think about the situation. I continued on, taking a very twisting, turning, meandering path. Taking this road, turning onto that, heading north, south, west, then east. All of a sudden, I came across that same van again. Again, they were heading in the same direction I was, and I pulled alongside them. The driver rolled down his window and leaned out. He was a late 20s white man, with a few inches of a goatee and baseball cap. He still had that large smile plastered across his face. I stopped my bike and looked over to him, waiting for him to say something, anything. He just looked at me for a good 30 seconds. Now, I know 30 seconds doesn't exactly sound like a long time, but you go flag down a stranger and just stare at them for 30 seconds. You realize that in that kind of situation, that much is a lifetime. Finally, he spoke up. "Hey, do you know David Christ?" This time, there was no smile on his face. He stared at me, and I began thinking to myself, is he joking? Does he really not remember he just asked me the same thing 20 minutes ago? Is he trying to be funny or something? Is he high? After a moment, I told him I still did not know anyone by that name and pedaled off down the road. It's at that time, though, I realized exactly how remote of an area I was in. I peered down the road and didn't see a house on its entire length. I was flanked by a cornfield on one side and a forest on the other. I looked over my shoulder, only to see the van slowly driving down the road away from me. It couldn't be a coincidence that I'd come across this same van 3 times. Not with me taking all these winding roads heading different directions. It made no sense. The only thing they could have been doing was just driving around, but why would they stop and ask me that same question? It was quite strange, and I was beginning to become more than a little concerned. Now I started to head back toward the town center. I pedaled hard, and the gravel road ahead of me had a bend to the right, and a dirt path that couldn't really even be called a road to the left. As I neared this fork, the van came around the corner once more. I gripped my pocket knife tight, which I always took with me on these kinds of rides just in case. I realized, though, that all they would really have to do is just run me down with the van, and I would be in serious trouble. As the van drew closer, I was ready to take off into those cornfields. It slowed down as it approached me, and the driver rolled down his window and leaned out again. This time, though, I did not stop riding. I increased my speed, even though I knew I could never outrun that van if they decided to give chase. I looked over my shoulder and saw it was now sitting in the middle of the road. I took the right fork and continued onto the gravel road until I could no longer see the van. I then stopped and got off my bike. I crept along the cornfield till I was at its edge and peeked down the road I had just been on. The van was now in the distance, driving away from me. I ran back to my bike, and then as soon as the van was entirely out of sight, I turned around and took the left fork along the dirt path. I rode as fast as I could, knowing that if the people in the van had nefarious things in mind and they caught me on this first path flanked by cornfields and far from an area anyone would come across us, that would be the very moment to attack. My ruse worked, or perhaps that van had never been after me at all. I made it the rest of the way to the town center without seeing them again. When I got home later that day, I was still replaying the events in my head. And that name, David Christ, kept creeping through my mind. Was he someone famous? Someone like a musician, I wondered? Should I have known this person? I decided to Google the name. I tried a couple of different spellings for Christ, but it was the Christ spelling that revealed a chilling result. I came across a newspaper article from Knoxville, Tennessee. The article explained how a man named David Christ had turned himself in after stabbing another man at a gas station in 2013. The article included a photo of this criminal, and it was that same man who had been driving the van, had a baseball cap and a few inches of a goatee, and it was a dead-on ringer. I did an inmate search of Knox County, and there was no David Christ in the inmate population. Somehow he had gotten out of prison in less than 2 years after stabbing a guy and made his way down to Michigan. Maybe he was never convicted. I couldn't find any articles about sentencing. Why was he driving along these back roads? Who was that silent woman in the passenger seat? And why the hell did he keep asking if I knew of him? Do I know of David Christ? Yes, I do now. In June of 2013, my best friend and I went on a bike trail that was about 60 miles one way. A man we used to work with lived on that trail and offered to let us stay at one of the 2 cabins that he rented out. We got there at about 30 to 40 miles into the trail. This was a nice cabin in all honesty. It had a TV, electricity, heating, AC, all the good stuff. Only thing is, that night a huge thunderstorm hit. No electricity or AC. We had dinner at the man's house and played some cards with him and his wife. His house was just down the street. After we headed back, we just kinda sat down on the couches in the cabin, quite bored. The man had a dog named Scout, and he'd come with us and kept us company. He was curled up on the couch next to me currently. Only a couple of minutes later, he kept on raising his head and staring over to the corner of the room. It was incredibly unnerving. It only got worse when my friend said my name in a really nervous voice, and then gasped. The speaker just moved. Above the TV, there were these 2 speakers, and I guess the one closest to the corner of the room had shifted a couple of inches before her very eyes. The dog also wouldn't stop staring at that particular corner of the room. I can't remember if we heard something upstairs or what, but we ran outside and sat on the front porch terrified. Something seemed wrong. Really, really wrong. I couldn't even bring myself to look into the house or through the windows. It was starting to get dark out, and we were too scared to go back inside. It was already pitch black in there, too. Here's where the story really got freaky and kind of weird. So my friend and I, we went there in June, right? Well, as we're sitting on the front porch, my friend gets a notification on her phone. It's a Facebook notification. All it says is I posted a photo on her timeline. Well, obviously, I didn't post a photo. I wasn't on Facebook. I had no internet. My friend was using her 3G, and most of all, why would my friend get a notification that I posted a photo out of nowhere? This was before you could even follow people. She opened up Facebook, and that photo popped up. It was a photo of me and 2 of my friends. She was not one of them. She was not even tagged in the photo, and that photo had been posted back in May. The description had been me being funny since my friends and I had just pulled an all-nighter. In this moment, though, the description was particularly poignant. We never sleep. I tried to be rational about all of this, but it doesn't make any sense to me. Why would she get that notification that I posted a photo a month ago when she wasn't even tagged in or following it at all? And why would it be that particular photo with that particular caption right in that moment? Quite honestly, I've never seen that kind of notification before or ever since. Eventually, we went back inside, ran upstairs, and barricaded ourselves in the bedroom. We pushed a dresser in front of the door. Unfortunately, the dog didn't stay with us that night. So I got two good ones here, the first one being the most recent. I was at my girlfriend's apartment on the first floor. We were there with two of our friends, drinking some and having a pretty calm night before we headed downtown. We go out onto her private porch, which is not accessible directly from the apartment. It was very close though, like the door directly next to the apartment door close. So here we are outside smoking cigarettes, when one friend asked who else is coming over while looking out the window. The apartment was a studio. I quickly looked in that direction, only to see a guy with that cracked out meth head hair and body looking through all the new cooking knives I had just hung out for her. Adrenaline immediately took over, and I ran inside to confront him. He tried to hide in a closet, but when I opened it, his first response was to scream like a banshee. I wish in that moment I had beat him a bit, but in all honesty, all I did was tackle and pin him down. Thankfully, I did, because he had picked up a medium-sized flathead from the closet, and he was definitely going to try and stab somebody with it. He did get arrested, but I still wish I beat him up though. The second story, this one's paranormal sounding, but I don't think it was an actual paranormal experience. So I'm out exploring this old asylum in Connecticut about 2 years ago in November. It was really cold, and for some stupid reason, I had decided to go all alone. Honestly, I was having a great time just quietly observing the overgrowth and decay, walking with a light step to avoid disturbing things too much. All of a sudden though, I hear this running in a hallway behind me. Whatever, it's probably some kids, so that's fine. I keep hearing it getting closer and closer though, on the other side of the walls from me. I shout out a friendly, "Hello?" and offer to trade some wine for weed. There's a pause, and then dead silence. Just this sudden and complete emptiness, even more so than before. I was not drinking yet either. That was for after I saw everything. I didn't take too much note of it though, and after a while I headed on to a new floor. Room after room, each one was a bit different. Then though, I heard that same run again, and this time a laugh. Not a little exploring kid or a weed-smoking teenager laugh, but a grown-ass 50-year-old man laugh. Not a fun laugh to hear, so I looked around. I called out a few times. Immediately, that silence crept in again. I was sweeping along the walls with my flashlight, looking for the right doors, when there I see it. Through a crack in an interior wall leading to a room I had just been in, I saw an eyeball. A blinking, bloodshot human eye, staring right at me, constricted and squinting with my light on it, but still staring. Of course, I freaked out. I was frozen. An exact map of the fastest route back to civilization embedded itself in my thoughts. He laughed that damn laugh again. It was so loud it was almost like he was right next to me. I immediately ran, and I ran and ran and ran until I got back to my house. That's about it though. I haven't thought about this story in years, but I guess I'll share it. I was about 10 or 11 at the time this happened. I was in the church softball league, and we had a game this particular day. I was about 3 people away from being up at bat, so I was standing outside and a bit down the third baseline, taking some practice swings. All of a sudden, this older guy came up from behind me and started to chat with me. He asked about the game, what league we were, all pretty mundane baseball stuff. He went on to tell me that he was currently looking for some help. You see, he'd accidentally locked his keys in his truck, and he was worried because his dog was in there and it was a really hot day. Thankfully though, his truck had one of those small windows in the back of the cab that was too small to fit through. It would be no problem for a child, though. Maybe I could do him a huge favor and help him out real quick. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How could you not realize this was sketchy? Or didn't your parents ever talk to you about stranger danger? Well, yes, they did. But I was 11 years old and it was broad daylight surrounded by people I knew and were friends with. So I thought I was really safe. It didn't really ring any alarm bells. It haunts me to this day how close I was to saying yes. I get the chills just thinking about it. The only thing that saved me was the fact that the person at bat happened to get a hit in that moment, putting me within 2 batters, aka in the hole. This meant I was almost up to bat. I told the man that I couldn't, but I was sure he would find some other kid around to help him. After the game, I nonchalantly mentioned it to my parents. They got real serious all of a sudden and began asking me all kinds of questions. What did he look like? What was he wearing? What direction had he come from? My dad picked up his phone and made a call to 911. I was of course scolded, but the gravity of this whole situation never really hit home. I'm 26 years old now, but a few years ago that incident came back up. It turns out my parents kept an eye out for it in the news. Lo and behold, a guy matching that description I gave them was arrested in the same area for attempted kidnapping not too long after. I decided to go hiking in Wekawa State Park. It's a place I'm extremely familiar with. The weather has been awful lately, so I haven't really been kayaking. My time in the state park is usually mostly spent kayaking. I was the only person out at this time because the weather was not that great. I was on the Orange Trail, maybe 2 miles in, when all of a sudden, I got the feeling of being watched. I kinda have a sixth sense for this sort of thing. If I feel like I'm being watched, there's an 80% chance that's true. I stopped for a moment and kept a closer eye out. As I started back in, I suddenly saw quick-paced movement out in the brush, maybe 50 yards from where I was. Somebody was trying to avoid being seen. That was weird, but I continued onward. As I continued down the trail, I continued to feel that feeling of being watched. All of a sudden, as I'm walking forward, I hear maniacal laughter out in the brush, maybe 20 or so yards to my left. Now, I was the only person around. I had not seen a single other individual in the entire park. This unsettled me, and I began to move faster. I tried to put it out of my mind. I must be imagining things. Maybe 2 minutes later, though, I hear that same maniacal laughter off to my left, this time just a bit closer. I started to pick up the pace substantially. Less than a minute later, I hear it right behind me. There's an enormous amount of rustling and noise coming from the brush just behind. I realized this person was now far too close. I fucking ran. I didn't look back, I just ran as hard as I could. Something was screaming at me that I could not stay in this place right now. Within a mile, I was sucking wind. I had put every single ounce of energy into my escape. I ended up becoming too weak to run. I stopped to rest for a moment. I didn't want to get bull rushed, so I turned around facing the direction I had been running from and took a knee. I was starting to calm down, but I didn't feel safe yet. I told myself I had to keep going. As I struggled to my feet, I spotted something off in the brush, a dark leather wrap. I unfolded it and found 3 extremely sharp knives, the type of knife you would use to stab someone. They were fresh too. You could tell they had been dropped there within the day. I let out an audible yelp when I realized what was inside the sheath. All of a sudden, every ounce of fear came rushing back. My body was telling me to be very afraid. I knew I had to keep moving. I jumped up and ran back to civilization. I didn't grab the knives to take with me because I thought it would add an immense amount of risk to an already dangerous situation. I had the feeling of being watched until I was a half mile from the trailhead. I'm not scared of anyone. People don't really have the ability to freak me out. but the fact that my body was telling me to be very, very afraid and to keep moving was terrifying. It was like a primal response that I just could not turn off.